Hello, historical geology students. This is the next video for this week. And we were talking about transgressions and regressions last time. Transgressions, in summary, are when sea level rises and covers up the continents. And when the continents are covered up by the ocean, it always means global warming. Because when the ice melts, sea level rises and you get a transgression. And usually when you get a transgression, you will have limestone on the top, like you see right here. Look at this group of sedimentary rocks called the Tonto Group in the Grand Canyon. Here you've got a section of you got a bed of sandstone called the Tapiat Sandstone. Then you got the Bright Angel Shale and the Mauve Limestone. So this sequence of sedimentary rocks is a transgressive sequence, meaning that sea level rose and invaded the land, depositing limestone on top. A regression is the opposite of a transgression, and when you have a regression, that means that sea level fell, so that the ocean retreated. Why do you get regressions? Regressions occur during ice ages when you have global cooling. So more and more of the ocean water gets stored up in ice near the North and South Pole, and sea level retreats from the land. To give you an idea how that works, our last ice age is called the Pleistocene. And Pleistocene is from 2 million years ago till 10,700 years ago. During the Pleistocene epoch, that's one of the units in the geologic timescale, Eon, Era, Period, Epoch. During the Pleistocene epoch, otherwise known as the Ice Age, you could walk 100 miles east of New York City and still be on the land. You can walk back then 100 miles from Fort Sumter in South Carolina, you'd still be on the land. That occurred during. That's a regression. And geologists use something called Volter's Law to determine whether or not a sequence of different sedimentary beds represents a transgression or a regression. How does Volter's Law work? Well, let's take a look here at a typical coastline. Typical coastline, you're going to have sandstone bed here, sandstone facies here, sandstone bed here near the shore. Why? Because you have beaches near the shore. And beaches are made of sand, and the sand will become quartz sandstone. As you go further offshore, you have mud and clay. You all know that because, well, maybe you don't know it, but where does beach sand come from? It comes from rivers, right? Rivers deposit their sand along the coastline, and the waves, currents, and tides redistribute that sand to form beaches. But further offshore, you have mud because the finer grained material from the rivers gets carried farther offshore since it's lighter and can be carried further. This clay will end up becoming shale. Further offshore, you have limestone. This is all in the shallow marine area here. So that's a typical situation. Sand close to the shoreline, then you have clay further offshore, and then you have lime mud. Where this lime mud is limey because the bodies of little creatures fall into the limestone and are preserved. So these limestones are often fossiliferous, filled with fossils. If you have a transgression, then the ocean's going to move onto the land, so that the lime is going to move further inshore, and so will the clay, and so will the sand. As the sea level continues to rise, the beach will retreat, and the lime will advance. So let's say we took a section of rock right here. This is called a drill core. We could drill into the earth and cut out a core of rock. What we'd see on top is limestone. On the bottom of that is shale, and by the bottom of that is sandstone. Sandstone is coarser grained. It's got bigger particles in it than limestone or shale. So this type of sequence is called a fining upward sequence. So when you get a transgression, transgressions are represented by fining upward sequences of sedimentary rock. Another way of saying it is, if you're looking at different sedimentary beds, an easy way to tell if you're looking at a transgressive sequence or regressive sequence is if it is a transgressive sequence, the size of the particles should become finer or smaller as you move upwards to the younger rocks. I'll repeat that. When particle size, grain size decreases, becomes finer as you go to the younger rocks, which are on top, that's a transgressive sequence. Let's take a look at the next one. A regressive sequence is the opposite of a transgressive sequence and occurs when you have ice ages or global cooling. Here you can see your sand, which will become quartz sandstone, your clay, which will become shale, and your lime, which will become limestone. Now you're seeing that the sea level is retreating during an ice age. If that's the case, then the beach is going to move further offshore. The muds will move further offshore, and the lime will move further offshore. Now again, we take a drill core, and what do we find on top? If we drill a vertical hole into the ground and pull and take out the rock, we'll find sand on top, sandstone on top, shale, and then limestone. See the difference? With a fine, this is a coarsening upward sequence. So when you get a regression, you form coarsening upward sequences. This is how geologists can figure out when sea level was rising or when sea level was falling, by looking at these stacks of sedimentary rock and looking at the particle size, the grain size. And as the grain size fines upward, we know we're dealing with a transgression. If the grain size becomes coarser or larger as you move upwards to the younger rocks, we're looking at a regressive sequence. Therefore, we can reconstruct the history of our planet's climatic cycles by looking at these sequences of sedimentary rocks using Volter's law. Let's talk a bit about fossils and fossilization. I love looking at for fossils. A lot of my spare time, I like to go look at fossils. Let me show you. Some of the stuff I go fossil hunting a lot. Let's see here. By the way, we just landed on Mars, which is an exciting thing. Here's my buddy here, Wesley Hayes, and I, Dr. Wesley Hayes. He's also my medical doctor, but he's a friend of mine. And we go looking for fossils all the time. This is us last week looking for fossils in Oliver Springs. And here's a common fossil in Tennessee. It's called Lapidiodendron. and it's from a tree that is now extinct, that was common in the swamps of Tennessee 280 to 300 million years ago. These are usually commonly found around coal beds. Coal beds are formed in swamps, and so we had swamps covering Tennessee back then. There's another one of my friends here in Randall Waters, and he and I and Wesley were looking for fossils. It's a lot of fun. This is in Oliver Springs. Anyway, you can do a lot of fossil hunting in Tennessee. There's two main kinds of fossils: body fossils and trace fossils. Body fossils and trace fossils. Body fossils are actual body parts. For vertebrates, that's usually bones. For invertebrates, creatures without a backbone, that's usually shells. Also, for vertebrates, we sometimes find teeth, too. Notice something important here is that we don't find soft body tissue. We only find hard body tissue. So how do you get the size of this to increase? I don't know why I did that. Decreased in size here. Alright, anyway. Let me show you some pictures of that. I'm going to show you some pictures of body fossils first. This is a skull of an ancient reptile. Here you can see a mammal. This is a Tyrannosaurus Rex skull. We're going to be talking a lot about dinosaurs later on in the class. Here's a claw from a dinosaur called an iguanodon. Here's a tooth from an ancient shark. But mostly, obviously, we find bones. It's hard to find bones, but we find them sometimes. Invertebrates, we find shells. And here's some common ones here. This is called a trilobite. You can see the eyes on top of the head. This creature here is a cephalopod. And cephalopods are squid or octopus-like creatures, and sometimes they have shells, like this nautilus that lives in the Southwest Pacific, and they get preserved in the rock record. So, body fossils are actual body parts, and almost always are hard body parts. Here you can see some body fossils. There's a skull of a duck-billed dinosaur. Here we got bivalves. We're going to be talking a lot about bivalves in this class. Bivalves. What are bivalves? Well, the easy way to remember that is just by thinking of the Latin. What does bi mean? Two. What does valve mean? Shells. These are creatures that have two shells. What type of creatures can you think of that have two shells? Oysters, maybe, clams, mussels, scallops, and they have a hinge, and they can open and close that shell, and the animal lives inside. The animal inside is rarely preserved. It's only the shell that is usually preserved. Why is that? Well, think about it like this. When a creature dies, including a human being, well, nowadays we get buried usually, but creatures die. They've got hard body parts and they got soft body tissue. And the best way to think about that is think of an animal that dies along the side of a road, becomes roadkill. What happens to that corpse? Well, first thing that happens is um, you'll see these big black birds that'll start picking on the corpse. And maybe other animals will start picking at the meat on the corpse. Then you're going to see, what are you going to see a couple weeks later if you look at that thing on the road, the corpse on the road? Well, it's decomposing. Why? Well, flies have laid their eggs inside the body, in the flesh, and maggots are starting to eat into the flesh. Bacteria, and it's going to start to smell too, because bacteria are going to start to eat into the flesh. And so what do you end up with after a couple months? Just bones, right? So the reason why we don't preserve soft body tissue is it usually gets consumed prior to fossilization. How does fossilization occur? Well, in order for fossilization to occur, the creature has to be buried rapidly by something like a landslide, either underneath the bottom of the ocean, where underwater landslide, or under a lake, or on the land. Why does rapid burial have to occur in order for a fossil to be preserved? Because if rapid burial doesn't occur, even those hard body parts will get consumed. Think about what happens to bones of that roadkill again. Other animals are going to start to eat the bone, chew the bones, and take the marrow out, and it'll start to break apart as the elements start to destroy it. I think about my dog outside right now. She would love it. She loves bones. I'm sure your dog does too. So, two things are required usually to preserve body fossils. The first thing that's necessary is that the organism has hard body parts. The second thing is that the organism must be rapidly buried. If both of those things occur, then you can form a fossil. The chances of a fossil forming are 1 out of a million. The creature has to be die, has to have hard body parts, has to be rapidly buried, and then several things can happen. Deep underneath the ground, there's groundwater, and the water could start to replace the bone with minerals, and then you can make a fossil like this. So if you're looking at these fossils here, this is not actual bone. The bone cells have been replaced by minerals. Now let me ask you a question now that you know how fossils are formed. Do you think we have a good geologic record of the evolution of worms? Think about it for a moment. No, because worms don't have hard body parts, and therefore they're almost never preserved. There are a few rare ways in which soft body tissue can be preserved, but before I get into those rare ways in which soft body tissue can be preserved, let's take a look at some of the typical ways that fossils are formed. The first is through mineral replacement, which I just explained, where the bone cells or the cells inside of shells for invertebrates are completely replaced by minerals like quartz and feldspars, for example. So here you can see that this used to be a tree. It's now made of quartz, but you can see all the grains on the wood. You can the grain of wood here on there. You can see cracks in the wood. The shape of the tree has been preserved. Or this organism here is a cephalopod. The shell has been replaced by minerals, pyrite in this case, fool's gold. This is one way that you can make fossils, by replacing the organic matter with minerals, which are inorganic. Another way you can make fossils is through casts and molds. So if an animal dies, you can make a mold of the creature. Let me show you what that looks like first. Molds. Let's do molds first. Think of a candle mold. How do you make candles? You need a mold, right? Here you can see over here, if I can move this window over, this creature here is called a Brachiopod, and you can see the organism has completely dissolved, leaving a mold. However, if the mold gets filled with sediments and minerals crystallize out, you can make a cast. So here's a cast of a Brachiopod. Casts and molds are typical fossils that you can find. My friends and I who go fossil hunting love to find casts and molds. Take a look right here. Again, we got another Cephalopod here. Which one is the cast and which one's the cast and which one's the mold? The one on the left is the mold and the one on the right is a cast. Another type of fossil is called is formed by carbonization. Usually plant leaves plants sometimes can be preserved if they're buried deep under a swamp, and we'll talk about that later. But all that's left of the plant is the carbon. All living things are made of carbon. You're made of carbon. Your dog is made of carbon. Some bird flying over northern India is made of carbon. A squirrel in the woods in Germany is made of carbon. All living things are made of carbon. When organisms died and all that's left behind is a carbon imprint like this, that's called a carbonized fossil. So I showed you some typical types of hard body parts. Now let's take a look at trace fossils. Trace fossils are indirect evidence of past life, such as what? Footprints. Okay, footprints are a typical type of trace fossil. What else can you think of that would be a trace fossil? Well, how about the tracks that are left behind by a snake as it winds its way through the desert? That would be a trace fossil. Or here you can see trace fossils and some animal left behind these tracks. Footprints are trace fossils for humans or dinosaurs, such as this one here. Another type of trace fossil is coprolites, which is fossil poop. And these can be revealing too, because they tell you something about what the organism ate, how many of them were around in the particular area. And a good paleontologist can tell what coprolites were left behind by dinosaurs, what were left behind by woolly mammoths, which ones were left behind by humans. It's the shape and the size of the feces, which has become stone now, so it doesn't smell. Those are coprolites. So trace fossils are indirect evidence of past life. Often at time we find little tunnels that were left behind in the ground as the organism buried itself deeper into the bottom of the ocean, forming tunnels. These are very common types of fossils. These are trace fossils. Here you can see various tunnels that were left behind by some creatures. Sometimes you will find a body fossil if something died in the tunnels. Here you see some tunnels. Those are trace fossils. I mentioned before that sometimes soft body tissue can be preserved. It's quite rare, but when we do find soft body tissue preserved, we get really excited as geologists because we can sometimes extract the DNA. One common way in which soft body tissue can be preserved is through extreme cold, such as this baby mammoth here that died 44,000 years ago. What is a mammoth? A mammoth is related to the modern day elephant, and they look like this. Our ancient ancestors hunted these big, hairy, woolly mammoths. Notice how their tusks are very distinctive shaped? Well, the last one of these died out about maybe 15,000 years ago. Our ancestors wiped them out. You can see them hunting the woolly mammoth. Well, since we can find some of these, we're hoping someday to clone these and bring these back and other extinct forms of life. So cold, extreme cold can actually preserve soft body tissue quite well. Let me show you some other examples of that. Have you ever heard of Otzi? Otzi is a man who died about 3,300 years ago, and they found his body preserved with the skin and muscle still there. The extreme cold preserved him, and we learned a lot about what he was like. And he was wounded by somebody shot him with an arrow, and he died 3,300 years ago. So cold can preserve fossils. Amber can also preserve fossils. Here you can see insects preserved in amber. Amber is tree sap, and sometimes creatures get preserved with their soft body tissue and amber. Here you can see various insects are quite common. You can see all kinds of, sometimes you'll find frogs. And sometimes you'll get some ancient air that's preserved in these, in this amber, and you can figure out what the atmosphere was like in the past. Another way you can preserve fossils is in tar pits. What are tar pits? Well, let's take a look here. There are these tar pits, and tar will travel to the surface of the earth. That's hydrocarbons. That's the heavy part of petroleum. And if it reaches the surface, they're called tar pits. And bones have been found in these tar pits of saber-toothed cats, for example, who also lived with the mammoths back during the Ice Age times. And here you can see what a saber-toothed cat skull looks like. Notice the big, long teeth. These have been found near Johnson City. So, saber-toothed cats, very muscular cats that were common during the Ice Age, during the Pleistocene. More fossils. So obviously this is my hobby. I love to go fossil hunting with my friend Wes and Randall and my girlfriend Jessica. Here you can see how molds and cats make fossils. Here's a creature with two shells. It's not a bivalve. There's another type of creature that has two shells that we're going to be talking about a lot, and these are called Brachiopods. And they also have two shells. Here you can see a typical one found in Tennessee. It's got two shells, and here's the hinge. These are different than the bivalves because one shell is bigger than the other shell, and it's always got this little beak here where the two shells meet, this little beak-like structure. These are called brachiopods. Anyway, this brachiopod died in the ocean, was rapidly buried by mud, forming this shell around it, and the shell dissolved, forming a mold. Later on, the mold was filled with some other sediment, maybe quartz, for example, and it became a cast. So this shows you how molds, if it doesn't get filled or there's just an opening here, that's a mold, and if it gets filled, it's called a cast fossil. William Smith was somebody who came up with one of the principles of relative dating called the principle of fossil succession, which means that you can use fossils to find out how old rocks are. Let's say we know that a particular species of brachiopod lived from 300 to 305 million years ago, and it was geographically widespread, meaning that it could be found all around the world. Then we could find out, if we find this particular type of brachiopod species in a rock in Tennessee, let's say in Knoxville, we know that that rock formed 300 to 305 million years ago. Now, if we find that same type of fossil in Lexington, Kentucky, then we know that that rock that formed in Lexington, Kentucky, and that rock that formed in Knoxville formed at the same time. And these type of fossils can be used to find rocks that formed at the same time at different locations. Let's say we can also find this same brachiopod in Yorkshire, England. We know that those rocks in Yorkshire, England, formed at the same time as those in Lexington and those in Knoxville. These special types of fossils that live for a short amount of time and are geographically widespread, you can find them all around the world, are called index fossils. Index fossils are gold to geologists because they, if you want to figure out how old a rock is, I mentioned to you before that you usually can't do that unless you have igneous rocks. And then you have to find radioactive isotopes in them. And then you have to use expensive machines called mass spectrometers to count parent and daughter isotopes. And then you have to hire people like me, I did this for 2 years, to run this machine and count parents and daughters. And then you have to know the half-life of that radioactive isotope. And then you have to figure out how many half-lives have gone by counting those parents and daughters. And then the whole process might cost you tens of thousands of dollars. Well, when you work for a company, let's say you work for ExxonMobil, and they wanted you to figure out how old rocks are at a particular location in South Dakota, your employer is going to appreciate it if you could date those rocks without using the mass spectrometer, because it's going to save them money. And you could do that if you have index fossils in the sedimentary rocks that you're trying to date. So index fossils are gold to geologists, and that's what William Smith figured out, is that we can see the same sequence of fossils appear in the rock record at different locations. And so we can use these index fossils to date rocks at different locations, and that's what we call correlation. stratigraphers like to do correlation, which is find rocks that are formed at the same time but at different locations. And the fossils tell us about the depositional environment. If it's a marine organism that's found in the rock, like coral, then we know the ocean covered that area in the past. If we find freshwater fish bones in the rock, preserved as fossils, we know that might have been a lake. If we find desert tortoise shells in a sandstone, we know that that rock was formed in a desert. And if we could figure that out for different periods of time, let's say from 300 to 310 million years ago, if we could find rocks that formed at the same time at different locations, can't we reconstruct what the Earth was like in the past? Then we know where the coastlines were, where the beaches were, where the rivers are, where we can reconstruct the way the Earth was in the past. And that's what we do in historical geology. Then we see how things change, how environmental conditions change by looking at the sedimentary rocks, using the principle of superposition, going to younger and older rocks, and then we know what happened at a particular location over time, such as Tennessee or New Hampshire or wherever you want to go. So this shows you how William Smith used his principle of fossil succession. Again, we have our stratigraphic columns. And these are the rocks that you find at a particular location. The stratigrapher might go to one location in Oliver Springs, and he might find limestone overlain by shale, overlain by sandstone, overlain by shale, overlain by limestone, overlain by shale. And then he might find these rocks here in Oak Ridge. And he might find these rocks here in Nashville. Well, he can use the fossil. If you can find these fossils at these three locations, you know that these rocks formed at the same time, even if the rocks are different. See, the rocks are different here than here and here. He knew that these rocks must have formed at the same time because these fossils only lived during this the same period of time. So if a location is close, you can just line up the rocks. But when you're talking about great distances, you need to use fossils to correlate rocks and to reconstruct what the Earth's surface looks like. First, from Oliver Springs to Oliver Springs to Oak Ridge, and Oak Ridge all the way to Nashville. And if you could do that for the whole planet with these different stratigraphic columns and correlate the rocks, that means find rocks that are formed at the same time at different locations, you can reconstruct what the Earth looked like in the past. So fossils are a great tool in reconstructing Earth history and how environmental conditions changed. So yes, we do need to know about shales and conglomerates and arkoses and what depositional environments might those rocks form. But the fossils fine-tune our understanding of our past, because if you find a quartz sandstone, it could have formed on a beach. Sand accumulates on a beach, right? But it could have also formed in the desert. Sand accumulates in the desert. Or it could have been on a river delta or in the bottom of a river channel. There are many places where sand accumulates and could form a quartz sandstone. So if you find a quartz sandstone, all you can really say is it formed on a beach or on the desert, on a river delta, or in a river. That's where we usually find sand, right? But we can't go further than that and say where exactly did that rock form unless we have fossils there. For example, if we find oyster shells fossils inside of that quartz sandstone, then we can narrow it down and say, aha, that quartz sandstone formed on a beach. So fossils allow us to really understand where sedimentary rocks form. The main unit of all of these that you need to remember is for stratigraphy is what is a formation and what is a bed. Well, a formation is a mappable geologic sedimentary bed. Let me show you how that works. Here's my buddy Wes and I looking at the Crab Orchard Mountain Sandstone. That's a formation, and and it's mappable. And so we could put it on geologic maps. And it's a quartz sandstone with a rose to brown colored coloration to it, and it's fine to medium grained sandstone. And it's recognized as a mappable geologic unit, which we use to make geologic maps. Let me show you the Geologic Map of Tennessee, for example. Here's the Geologic Map of Tennessee, and you can see each of these colors is a different formation. And if you want to, for example, if you were here in in central Tennessee near Nashville, then you might want to wonder, if I'm right here, what kind of rocks would I see? I'd go over to this pink color, and then I go down here, and they'll tell me, aha, this is a Arcos, or whatever it is. This is a conglomerate. And so we have these maps of all 50 states, all 13 Canadian provinces, and so formations are geologic units of sedimentary rock that are mappable, and they're well described, and they're used to make geologic maps. It's the basic. Here you got different formations here. The Cedar Mesa Sandstone, the White Rim Sandstone, the Kaibab Limestone. These have all been described so that if you're a geologist and you go to this location, you'll know, aha, this is the Navajo Sandstone, or this is the Moan Copy Formation. You go to your geologic map and you find out what rocks should be there. And then it'll describe those rocks in great detail, and you try to find them here. And here's the rocks on the bottom. You want to locate that formation, and this one on top. Here you might have 3 formations here. So what is correlation again? Once again, what stratigraphers do is they look at sedimentary rocks at one location, for example, this location, and they identify the formations. Here's the Halgado Shale here, and here's the Cedar Mesa Sandstone here. On the very top, we find some Oregon Rock Shale. You might need some mountain climbing equipment to see that. And these boundaries between these formations are called bedding planes. They separate the different formations. Then we drive our truck or our SUV or our car over here, and we look and see what we can find over here. Aha, we find Halgado Shale here, Cedar Mesa Sandstone here. Here's the boundary between them. That's the most important thing, the bedding plane. And we don't find the Oregon Rock Shale here. What happened to the Oregon Rock Shale over here? It must have been eroded away, right? And so you could draw these lines to show that the Halgado Shale over here is the same as that over here. Cedar Mesa Sandstone here is the same as that over here. This is called correlation. Now, no rock is going to continue forever, because this Oregon Rock Shale, let's say it formed on a lake doesn't continue forever. It ends somewhere. So you're not going to find the same sequence of sedimentary rocks at different locations, because these sedimentary rocks represent depositional environments which have geographic limits to them. If you found the same stack of rocks everywhere, geologists wouldn't be paid in the 6 figures, would they? They get paid to do correlation. And here you can see, if you got these 2 stratigraphic columns here, which is somewhere, you could do this kind of work in about 2 hours. Here's one location. And you mark this place on your map so you know where it is. Here's another location. There's 100 kilometers between these two locations, which is about 60 miles. And you found this sandstone in this shale and this sandstone in this shale, so you could draw that correlating line here, and this correlating line here between the shales and the limestone. But notice here that this sandstone is not here at this location, and this is called a pinch out. That's where the sandstone between these two locations disappeared somewhere in between those two locations, and this is how we draw a pinch out. The rest of them are pretty straightforward. You can see that this shale lines up with this one over here, and shale, limestone, shale, limestone. You could draw your correlating lines here. The farther apart stratigraphic columns are, the more pinch outs you're going to have, and then it gets quite complicated. Stratigraphers can try to find rocks that are formed at the same time at different locations. And most stratigraphers get hired by the oil companies or the mining companies to look for natural resources. So you can see, I showed you a very simple correlation, but you can see that correlation can be quite complicated here. You have to figure out what happened between different locations and draw these lines in, and they have to be accurate. This stack of rocks here is thick, and then it's become thinner here, and it disappears somewhere between here and here. And so there's a lot of, it's like a very complicated crossword puzzle you got to figure out. And later on, we're going to try and do some stratigraphic correlation. Let's see if I can give you some examples here. I think you could, let's see, I want to do some simple stratigraphic correlation here. So, stratigraphic correlations means finding rocks that are formed at the same time at different locations, drawing those lines in. I don't know if I can get you a good example here. I might have to do that in a later video. I'll do that in a later video, but here you can see this is real simple correlation right here, and this is very simple correlation. But obviously, if it was, it's not this simple in the real world, because rocks at one location might be much different than at another location. You have to use index fossils. You have to use your knowledge of geology to try and figure out which rocks formed at the same time at different locations. Another name that for an index fossil is a guide fossil. So I'm guessing that the author of this book was British, because they used the term guide fossils. Don't get confused when you hear that word guide fossils. This is the British way of doing it. The guide fossils, you Americans, you don't use that. You use index fossils, which means you're not speaking the Queen's language, are you? Anyway, so look at this species called Lingula. It lived from about 480 million years ago, and it still exists today. Would it be a good index fossil, do you think? No. Lingula would be a horrible index fossil. Why? Because if you find Lingula in a sandstone, for example, can you tell how old that sandstone is? No. It could be 480 million years old. It could have formed yesterday. It could have formed 430 million years ago. It could form 280 million years ago. So Lingula lived for too long a period of time to be useful as an index fossil. On the other hand, Atripa, this brachiopod, lived for this short amount of geologic time, between about 440 to 435 million years ago. So if we find Atripa and it's geographically widespread, it's an excellent index fossil because it really narrows it down. We know when this rock formed. It formed between 430 or 435 million years ago. This trilobite here, which is also geographically widespread, would be an excellent index fossil or guide fossil. If you can't find index fossils in a rock, what we use is the concurrent range method instead. What's that mean? Well, when we're trying to date rocks, if we can find fossils, we'd rather use fossils than use radioactive isotopes because it's cheaper, and your company is going to would rather spend less money in getting the same answer. If you can't find fossils, you have to find igneous rocks, and then you have to do the radioactive isotope dating. But if you can find fossils, you look for the index fossils. If you can't find index fossils, then you use this other method called the concurrent range zone method. What's a concurrent range zone method? Well, let's say we found a limestone, and we wanted to figure out how old is this limestone formation. And let's say we find fossil A, and it lived from 290 million years ago, and it died out 10 million years ago. It's not a very good index fossil, and it doesn't really help us too much, because all we know is that that rock could have formed anywhere from 290 million years ago to 10 million years ago. But now let's say we find another fossil, and this is a cephalopod, and it lived from 542 million years ago, and it died out 100 million years ago. Okay? Now we have something more to work with. What was the only time period where both of these creatures could have been alive? Well, the rock can't be older than 290 million years old, and it can't be younger than 100 million years old, because that's the fossil B never made it past 100 million years ago. Now we've narrowed it down to 290 million years ago to 100 million years ago. Now let's say we find another fossil, and we'll just call it fossil C, and it's a kind of creature called a bryozoa, which we'll talk about later. And let's say that it lived from 180 million years ago to 330 million years ago. 330 million years ago. What's the only time period where all three of these creatures could have lived? Think about it for a moment. Well, it can't. It has to be older than 330 million years old, right? Because but it has to be, actually, let me think. So the oldest this can be is 290 million years. And the oldest this is 542. The oldest this is 180. So that means the oldest it could possibly be would be 290 million years ago. No, actually. 330. No, 330 is the oldest this could be. And the youngest, oh gosh. Anyway, I think 290. Okay, let me figure this out real quick here. So if I just did this, oh shit. I'm going to have to change these numbers here because I forgot what the other ones were. 280 to 410 million years. Okay, so 290 to 10, 290 to 100. 280 to 100. So this must have formed between 280 million years ago and 100 million years ago. I think. Let's see, yeah. Yeah. That's the only time where all three of these could have lived. So the concurrent range method is figuring out the ranges of time where all these species lived, and then finding the time period where all of these could have lived together. Here you can see correlating two stratigraphic columns here, and that's what geologists do. And what they did is they used ash beds. Ash beds are excellent time markers because they're formed by volcanic eruptions. So that, for example, Mount St. Helens, it erupted in 1980, right? So if you find volcanic ash in the soil in Washington, you know that that ash was deposited in 1980. If you find that also in Minnesota, then that ash there was also formed in 1980. Then you can correlate between Minnesota and Washington. So ash beds are another time marker we can use to correlate sedimentary rocks at two different locations. Last thing I want to talk about is what is a species. Okay, what is a species? Well, let's look at our species here. Homo sapiens. That's our species, Homo sapiens. And notice that we use what we call binomial nomenclature, which means we use two words for a species. The first is capitalized, and the second is in small caps. My dog outside, who I'm going to let in a second, it belongs to a species called Canis domestica, and sometimes called Canis familiaris too. But a species is two words. The first is capitalized, and the second is in small caps. The first word that is capitalized is called the genus of the species. For example, wolves belong to the species Canis lupus. So dogs and wolves belong to the same genus. What is a species? A species is a group of individuals who, under natural conditions, can reproduce fertile offspring. I'll repeat that. A species is a group of organisms who, under natural conditions, will reproduce and produce fertile offspring. All human beings on the planet belong to the same species now, because we can all mate and produce fertile offspring, assuming we're sexually fertile. However, there were other members of the human race that are now gone, like Homo erectus, which we'll talk about later on, or Homo habilis. Now we're going to talk about numerical ages of sedimentary rocks. And ladies and gentlemen, take a good close look here and see if we can figure out how old the rocks are in this diagram, using our knowledge of relative dating and geology. Here you can see different sedimentary rocks and igneous rocks. Here, let's look at this data here. We have got this dike, and It's been dated using radioactive isotopes to be 5 million years old. We've got a batholith here, an igneous pluton, that is 12 million years old. We have volcanic ash that was formed 8 million years ago. And we have a lava flow here that's been dated as forming 18 million years ago. So we've got something to work with here, don't we? How old are these sedimentary rocks here, these three sedimentary beds? Well, they're on top of the ash fall, so they must be younger than 8 million years old. But they're cut by the dike, so they must be older than 5 million years old. Bottom line is these three beds were formed from 5 to 8 million years ago, weren't they? Now here's an unconformity, by the way, here. But what about these rocks here underneath the lava flow, first of all? How old are the rocks underneath the lava flow? Well, these two, the sandstone and the shell, these two beds. Well, they must be younger than 18 million years old because they're under the lava flow, but they're cut by the batholith, which is 12 million years old, so they're older than 12 million years old. So these two beds are between 12 and 18 million years old. So we can use our knowledge of relative dating and numerical dating to figure out how old rocks are. All the rocks between this ash fall and this lava flow must be between 8 and 18 million years old. Right? So we're going to do that in a later lab. Remember, ash falls are wonderful. When you find volcanic ash falls, they are time markers. Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD released its ash, and that marks wherever you find that ash from Mount Vesuvius, you know those rocks were formed during 79 AD. Okay, we'll call it quits here because I'm getting kind of tired, but I'll make another video for you later.